Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ask the Expert webinar, Tricks for Report Builders, Report Design Best Practices. My name is Tiago de Souza, and I will serve as your moderator for today's event. Now, I would like to take a moment to introduce our presenter, Nicole Ball, a Principal Technical Training Consultant here at SAS. Nicole teaches courses on SAS Visual Analytics, SAS Data Quality, and the SAS Programming Language. Nicole is also a course developer for SAS Visual Analytics, which includes writing and updating courses and preparing customized training. Before coming to SAS, Nicole was an economic analyst at the Federal Reserve, where she learned more about SAS code and how to apply it to real-world problems. She has a master's degree in economics from the University of Texas at Dallas and a bachelor's degree in economics from Trinity University in San Antonio. With all of that out of the way, why don't we turn things over to our presenter so we can get started. Nicole, please take it away.
Thanks, Tiago. Hi, everybody. Today, let's talk a little bit about some tricks for creating some really impactful reports in visual analytics. As we all know, it's pretty easy to create a report in visual analytics, but what's not so easy is creating a report that looks really good. So we're going to talk about some tips to think about as you create your reports. We're going to go through 5 steps of how I would build a report and the things I would think about along the way. First, we need to think about drafting a plan for the report. Then we need to think about choosing the best chart. Next, we'll focus on what's important. Then we'll consider the layout. And then finally, we'll test, and test again. So when we draft our plan, we need to do certain steps to ensure that our report is created the way we see it. We're going to start with selecting our data. We also need to know our audience. We're going to craft our story and then sketch the design. So when I select my data for visual analytics, I need to keep in mind that my report can be built on data that's any format. This can be SAS datasets, Microsoft Excel files, database tables, or text files. It doesn't really matter as long as I load the data to CAS. In addition, my report can contain multiple tables. In visual analytics, I can combine tables using a join and use multiple data sources to build the report. Also, once I'm in the report and I'm using visual analytics, I can create some data items for my report. I can create one-click calculations like the difference from the previous period. I can create hierarchies to enable drill down to different levels of my data. I can create geography data items that enable me to view data on a map. I can create parameters that enable the report viewer to have more control over the report. And then I can create some statistical data items like splines, interaction effects, and I forgot the other term, but I can create some statistical data items as well to help me when I'm building my statistical objects. Now, even though I can use multiple tables and create data items in visual analytics, it's a best practice to prepare your data before using it in visual analytics. So if I wanted to join tables, I would recommend doing that ahead of time. And if there's some data items that I need that I know about ahead of time, I would create those then as well. So some of these things you want to do in the data preparation phase. The next step is knowing your audience. Your audience will let you determine what to present, what level of detail to present, and how to present it. For example, let's say that I'm presenting my report to statisticians. They understand statistics really well, so I can use the visual statistics or data mining and machine learning objects. They would know what this cluster analysis looks like and can understand just by looking at it what it's trying to tell us. Now, however, if I was presenting to a general audience, they probably would not understand what this cluster analysis looks like. It's very pretty, but they probably don't understand the details. So in that case, I would present more simple objects like key value objects and bar charts, and I might provide additional details to describe to them what they're seeing. So you always need to consider your audience first before you create your report. Next, the other thing you can do once you understand your audience and how they're going to interact with the report is you can set the viewer customization level. This is set at the report level, and you can set to enable the viewer to make simple edits like add data labels, hide legends, things like that. You can set the customization level to comprehensive edits where they can change the chart type, or you can set it to data edits where they can actually change the data that's used in roles, ranks, and filters. And again, this depends on your audience, right? If you have an audience that's just more hands-off and they want to see what's available, you might want to set it to simple edits. If you have an audience that wants to play around with the data a little bit more, you might set the customization level to data edits. Then once you understand those things, you need to start crafting your story. Building a report is all about trying to tell a story to keep your viewers involved. So you have to think about, are you trying to persuade your audience? Do you want them to take action on something? Or are you just presenting facts? Knowing these things will help you create your story as you build your report. Next, you'll sketch your design. This can involve creating an outline of the report, maybe drafting the report, building a table of contents, and things like that. Oftentimes what I'll do is I will actually draw pages on paper and then put the objects that I think might be useful to help me tell my story. As I sketch the design, I always want to keep the story in mind. So just think of your report as a story where each page is like a part of that story. So that will help you determine what things to talk about on each page of your report. At this time, I would also recommend planning for accessibility. This will give you a good idea of what needs to be included as you start to build your report. So if you have a lot of report viewers that use keyboards, you might want to think about adding keyboard shortcuts somewhere along the report. If you have a lot of report viewers that use I blanked on the term, but if you have a lot of report viewers that have the computer tell them what's displayed in the report, you might want to have additional details. So add some additional text to describe your report so they can understand that as well. So that's the first step of the phase of creating your crafty report. Next, we're going to talk about how do I choose the best chart? And there are some best practices to keep in mind. So first, you'll want to use the simplest graph. You'll want to use visually appealing, easy to understand objects. Use only the most important data. Keep graphs simple. Use a zero baseline. Use two-dimensional charts, and then choose colors wisely. So again, we always want to think about our audience. So who is the audience? And now we also want to think about what type of data do I want to display? It's always best to use the simplest graph possible. You don't want to display something in a word cloud that you can easily show in a bar chart. In this example, both of these charts are showing the same exact data. They're showing total profit by company. And you can see in the word cloud, it's a little bit more difficult to compare the values for each company. For instance, is Orion Spain or Orion Italy larger? I can't really tell. But in the bar chart, I can easily compare those values and see which one is larger. So always think about using the simplest graph available. I know word clouds can be very cool and very exciting, but if you want your audience to be able to compare the companies, it might be better to display it in a bar chart. Also, as you start building your charts and making some changes to options, you can use object templates to speed up your development time. So those are things in visual analytics that enable you to keep your options as you build the same graph over and over again. You want to use visually appealing, easy to understand objects. And again, what's easy to understand really depends on your audience. Something that's easy to understand for statisticians might not be easy to understand for the general population. So this is very focused on audience as well. You want to use only the most important data. So show only what's necessary to convey your message. In this example, we're again showing the same exact data, but the chart on the right has additional details that aren't needed to comprehend the graph. In this case, we're using various lattice columns and lattice rows and values to display the same information that aren't really necessary. In addition, if lattice columns and lattice rows are used, you need to notify users, especially those that use screen reader technology, because they might not be able to read those lattice rows and lattice columns effectively. You want to keep your graphs simple. What this means is you want to avoid chart junk. And basically, chart junk is any elements, visual elements in your graph that are not needed to convey your message. In this case, this line chart is showing the same exact data. But in the top chart, we've removed all chart junk. So you can see things like the axes, the grid lines, the labels are not necessary to convey the message to get the point across, especially since we have data labels added to the chart. So the chart on the top is much cleaner looking, it's easier to read, it's less messy than the one on the bottom. So it'll get our point across a lot cleaner. Also, you want to keep in mind that you'll want to use a zero baseline. If you don't use a zero baseline, this could lead to some misinterpretation. Again, both of these charts are displaying the same data. The chart on the left uses a zero baseline, so we can see that all profits are positive, whereas the chart on the right uses a baseline of $50,000. This can be confusing for viewers because they might think some of these area codes have negative profit, when in fact, the profit is still positive, it's just less than $50,000. So it's a best practice to use a zero baseline whenever possible. You also want to use two-dimensional charts. And this one I don't see as much as I used to, but everybody in the past would really like to see the three-dimensional charts. They add a bit of interest, but it can be very difficult to read the data values. In fact, in visual analytics, you can't even create three-dimensional charts. I had to use Excel to create the don't do this option for this purpose. But you can see again, these two charts display the same information. The three-dimensional chart, however, it's difficult to read some of the values. So we might be missing some vital information. For example, I can't see the value for product cost of sale, the orange line, for the first quarter of 2015 or the first quarter of 2016. So I don't even know what those numbers are. Also, it tends to distort the data. So values that are close together might seem like they're far apart, just depending on the angle you're viewing the chart. When you want to plan for accessibility, you also may want to consider rotating attributes for data element styles for multi-line charts. What that would mean is instead of displaying two solid lines, like in this example, one line would be solid and one would be dashed, which enables people who have hard time distinguishing colors be able to view the chart a little bit better. This is something you can set at the report level. So there's an option to do this. You also want to choose colors wisely. This one I think gets a lot of people. Just because you can color all of the things differently doesn't mean you should color all of the things differently. Again, both of these charts are displaying the same information, but the chart on the right tends to overuse colors. Notice that it's using different colors for all of the elements of the chart. The axes are different colors, the text is different colors, the legend's different colors. Also, it's doing a background color. It's much cleaner if you make sure all of your text is consistent. Typically, we suggest not using more than one font and a couple of different sizes for your report. And it's also much cleaner if you don't overuse colors. You also want to consider accessibility. The chart on the right might be difficult for people who have issues distinguishing between colors to read that value. Also, one of the things you can do in visual analytics, if you want to use a set palette of colors, is to create custom themes to customize your color palette. So for example, you can use, instead of the default blue and yellow, as we see in the chart on the left, you can use colors that match maybe your organization or the colors that are specified for your project. Above all else, you want to show the data. So Edward Tufte, the godfather of data visualization, this is one of the things that he recommends. So every time you think about how do I create a chart, remember the focus is the data, not all of the extra stuff that you might see. So that's choosing the best chart. In addition to some of those best practice, we have some recommendations on what types of charts to choose depending on what you're trying to present. So it depends on if you're highlighting one important fact, you're comparing two or more things, you're showing survey or questionnaire results, describing how parts relate to the whole, showing relationships between data items, or do you even need a graph? Is it even required? All of those features will go into determining what's the best chart to use to display your data. So what chart do you choose? Again, it really depends on what you're trying to showcase. Are you highlighting one important fact? If so, you might want to use a key value object to display one specific number or dynamic text. Both of those are great for highlighting one specific number. In addition, you can use things like display rules to highlight important values. In this case, for the donut chart, we have a display rule applied to one value, the one that we'd like to highlight. The same is true for the bar chart. Are you comparing two or more things? If so, you might want to use a bar chart to show that information. You can use the group rule to split the bar between both of the groups. You can also use a dot plot to compare values that are close together. In this case, all of the product line values have order numbers that are fairly close. Notice in this one specific example, the dot plot doesn't start at a 0 baseline. There are certain charts that you can use for that purpose. You can also use a butterfly chart to compare two opposing groups, or a dual axis chart to compare two measures over time, over an ordinal value, or just over regular values. Be careful when you use dual axis charts, however. Some people don't understand them, so depending on your audience, you might need to provide additional details on how to read the dual axis chart. One other thing to keep in mind is that users of sonification might benefit from fixed axis ranges. What that means is those users would come into a chart and they would hear different tones depending on where the values are in the chart. So if the axes are fixed, those tones will differ based on their position. However, it's important to remember that if your data changes frequently and varies widely, fixed axis ranges might not be appropriate because your data can go outside of the fixed range and you might not even know about it. So that's why we say to cautiously consider using them. If you do have viewers that use sonification, you might want to play around with it a bit. That will help them view the chart a little bit better. Also, if you're comparing two or more things over time or over some ordinal value, you can use a line chart or a time series plot. Often when people use time series plot, there's an option to use an overview axis, which enables you to focus on a specific range of the time series. However, avoid using these because it's hard for users who view the report with screen readers to access the overview axis. Also, as you view things over time, you might consider animation, but again, use it with caution because it's hard for users with screen readers to understand how the animation works. So all of these things you want to keep in mind, and you need to know your audience to determine which of these features you should or should not use in your report. If you're comparing things against a benchmark, you can use reference lines to set a specific benchmark value. You can use a needle plot to compare against a specific baseline. You can also use display rules to highlight values that exceed or do not meet that particular threshold. In this case, all of the continents that don't meet the threshold are colored in pink, and those that do are colored in blue. You can also use a targeted bar chart to see a different target for each specific value, as we see here. Sometimes it might be useful to use a gauge because they are very simple. In this case, we're showing a sales goal and showing how close we are to meeting that sales goal. When you start using gauges, however, you need to specify color gradients for the ranges, and it's a best practice to avoid 3 color gradients that go from one color to a completely different color. So for example, that go from red to green or blue to orange, because it can be quite difficult for users who are colorblind to distinguish between those colors. If you do use 3 color gradients, it's best to stick with the same color and choose colors that differ in their luminosity, so it's easy to distinguish them. The best way to determine if that's the case is to print this in black and white. And if you can easily distinguish between colors, users that have color blindness or color deficiency can distinguish between it as well. If you want to show survey or questionnaire results, you can use a stacked bar chart for Likert responses. So these are questions that have answers like always, never, occasionally, often, and sometimes. You can use a vertical bar chart for all that apply questions. If you want to see details like down to the number, you can use crosstabs or tables to show that information. In addition, you can use box plots to show lots of information about the survey. You can see the average, the median response, the 75 percentile, the minimum, and the maximum. Just be aware that box plots can be very difficult to read for some users, so it's another issue where you want to consider your audience. If you want to describe how parts relate to the whole, you can use a donut chart or a pie chart if you have a few number of groups. I would say less than 5. You can also use the stacked bar chart to show that information as well. A tree map can be useful for comparing many values, and a histogram can be useful for showing a range of values. The geomap is useful for showing details by location. All of these are great for describing how parts relate to the whole. However, I would be cautious in using pie charts and donut charts. They are often difficult for users to read. It's hard for users to compare the size of the slices to determine their values. If you do decide to use them, you should add the values to the chart so that users can easily compare them. Typically, I try to avoid donut charts and pie charts. They are not my favorite. And you don't have to take it from me. You can listen to the data visualization experts. Edward Tufte, the godfather of data visualization, said, "The only thing worse than a pie chart is several of them." And Stephen Few, another great data visualization expert, said, "Save the pies for dessert." And I couldn't agree more. So typically I like to avoid pie charts. You can show the same information a lot easier in a bar chart. If you want to show the relationship between data items, you can use a scatter plot or a heat map to compare 2 values. Scatter plots are typically useful if you do not have a lot of distinct values, and heat maps are useful if you do. If you want to compare 3 values, you can use a bubble plot. If you want to look at the linear correlation between multiple values, you can use a correlation matrix. Whenever you start looking at values, it's a best practice to limit digits that are displayed after decimal points. This can be very useful for users of screen readers, because if there's like 10 digits displayed after a decimal point, that's a lot of numbers for the screen reader to read. So it's recommended to limit those values. You can also use the path analysis to show how things progress along a specific path. This path can take many different roads, or it can be one distinct path. You can use a network diagram to show many relationships, or you can even use something like a text object just to show bullet points. So something that's maybe not required to do in a specific order, but that needs to be accomplished. As you start using some of these objects like the path analysis and the network diagram, be sure that the legends can be displayed on all screen sizes, especially the screen sizes that your viewers will use to view the report. Often when the legend is not displayed, it becomes a button that doesn't have a name and isn't accessible to users of screen reader technology. So you want to test thoroughly to make sure that that legend appears. Is a graph even required? In some cases, you don't need a graph to display the information you want to show. In this case, we're showing a word cloud that shows all of the search terms at a specific recipe website. So this can be useful for seeing those search terms that are in vogue that people are looking for. You can also use images to show diagrams. You can build illustrations, and you can create specific objects like this with the data-driven content. In addition, you might want to use a text object just to describe what's going on. So it's not always necessary to use graphs in your report to convey the message that you want. If you do use things like text objects, it's recommended to limit sensitivity characteristics, like specifying the size of an object, its shape, or its position on the screen, because it can be difficult for screen readers to announce that information, to verify that. So all of those best practices and chart types are helpful for choosing your best chart. And I would really think about these for every chart that I create in my report. Is this chart intended for what I'm trying to convey? Next, we want to focus on what's important. In this step, we want to make sure that our report is organized, easy to navigate, versatile, and attractive. We can make sure our report is organized by using multiple pages. Again, each page would tell a part of our data story. It's important to limit the number of objects on each page. Typically, we say 4 to 6 objects per page, and each page should focus on a single idea. So this is really where your data story comes in handy. It can help you determine what objects to display on each page and what pages you need to convey your message. In addition, each page should stand on its own. A viewer shouldn't be expected to remember something that was presented on one page to understand something that's shown on a different page. You can use hidden and pop-up pages to provide additional details, and we recommend that you limit the number of pages in your report as well. Again, 4 to 6, that includes hidden pages too. If you need more than 7 pages to tell your data story, maybe your data story should be a saga, and it should be represented as multiple reports. And then you can use links between them to get all of the information that your viewers need. This is a big one. Most people, the reports that I've seen, there are many, many, many pages. Again, you want to keep things simple, make it easy for your viewers to navigate the report. Speaking of navigation, some of the ways that we can make our reports easy to navigate are by adding descriptions. I always recommend that we use clear, detailed titles for our objects that describe exactly what's going on in that particular graph or object. And you can add additional details and numbers when needed. One of the things that we recommend for accessibility and for different audiences is if you have a very complex graph, you can add the same information in an easier to understand graph, like a list table or a bar chart. So that's a great way to add additional details. In addition, you should always add instructions. I'm a big proponent of this. You can do this by adding a table of contents or an introductory page to your report to describe what the viewer should expect when viewing the report. In addition, it might be helpful to add instructions for each page and to explain report actions. That's a big one. There are so many things you can do in visual analytics that require you to click around. Every time your viewer can click to do something, you should tell them about it. They shouldn't be expected to just click everywhere and see what happens. So you really need to explain those report actions. What I typically do is when I have actions, I add a text object that it says something like, hey, double click a bar to get more details, or double click a scatter to see more information about that particular person. Now, as we start adding these descriptions and instructions, it's important to use consistent fonts. We talked about this already. And then it also might be helpful to provide details for keyboard shortcuts, especially if I have users that use a keyboard to navigate my report. Those things are not often intuitive, so it might be helpful even to link to information that has those details. We also want to make sure that our reports are versatile, and we can do this in many different ways. We can do it by adding animation to graphs. This helps us view changes over time. Whenever we look at animation, we want to focus on differences from the norm. So if everything's moving in one direction and something is moving in a different direction, that thing that's moving in a different direction is the one I want to focus on. Now, again, be cautious about using animation because it can be difficult for users of screen readers to understand that. We can also add ranks to focus on important values. This can help us identify leaders or laggers. We can add actions to add interactivity to our report. This helps our report viewers self-discover the things that they're interested in. So it makes our reports very dynamic. We can add prompts to focus on specific areas. These can be used to filter a report, a page, or specific objects. We already talked about viewer customization, where the viewer has more control over the report depending on what you specify. Remember, at the basic level, they can modify options. Then the middle level is changing chart types. And then the highest level is changing the data. You can also add links to provide more information. These can be internal links that link to another page, or they can be external links that link to another page or something else in your organization. Now, as you start making your reports versatile, you might want to try out automatic actions to speed up development time. These add the actions to all the objects on the page simultaneously, so you don't have to define them individually. So check those out. You also want to make sure that your report is attractive. You can do this by setting styles and adding display rules. As you start adding color to your report, however, you need to think about what those colors, what emotions those colors invoke. And those emotions can be different depending on where you're located. Here are some examples of some colors you might use in your report. On the left side, we see all of the emotions that are positive emotions. And on the right side, we see the negative emotions. So you want to consider both of those as you choose colors for your report. For example, oftentimes when people see green, they think, oh, good, like go, this is excellent. And when they see red, they think bad, this is dangerous. So some of these emotions you might want to use to your benefit, and some of them you might want to avoid just so that you don't alert your report viewers to something you're not trying to show. As you add display rules, it's a best practice to specify labels for display rules. That is an option. Those are read by screen readers and are displayed in the options pane, so they are very useful for users. Also, for accessibility, you want to use WCAG compliant colors. So those are colors that people who have color deficiency or issues distinguishing between colors can tell the difference. There is a website you can go to see which colors are useful. This will also help you determine what text to put on different colors. So for example, you'll notice in the yellow text, I used a black font to show the values more clearly, but in the black text, the black box, I used a white font to show the colors more clearly. So you'll always want to think about that as well. So the third step is focusing on what's important. Next, we need to consider the layout. As we build our report, we want to think about how we're going to lay the report objects out on the screen. We'll want to limit the number of pages used in the report, limit the number of objects. When we start talking about important objects larger, consider their placement, and arrange objects with actions in a logical order. We'll also use negative space and use the default grid layout or containers to make our report look very nice. So limit the number of pages. We talked about this. The recommendation is 4 to 6. If you need more than 7, consider splitting them into 2 separate reports. In addition to limiting the number of pages, we also want to arrange the pages to advance our data story. So if we think somebody should view one page first and then another page second, we want to arrange them in that order. So for example, if I was creating a report on this presentation, I would have a table of contents to display what they're going to see in that report, to describe the purpose of the report, and then maybe link to each page. And then I would arrange each page in the step order that I would recommend. So draft a plan is first, choosing the best chart is second, and so on. It is always important to add a table of contents or introductory page to your report. This is extremely useful for report viewers. On this table of contents page, you can describe the report, its purpose, its audience, and the data. In addition, you can add the data update schedule, and then you can describe each page and maybe link to those pages as well. This makes it easy for your report viewers to navigate through your report, right? And that's one of our goals, make it easy to navigate. In addition, you can put some more details, like if there are data cautions or you want to explain the metrics used in the report, you can add those as well. You can use the page links to control the navigation of the report, especially from the table of contents pages. And then you can use pop-up pages to provide additional details. Just remember, when you use those, you need to alert your viewers to their presence. You also want to make more important objects larger. The larger the object, the more time the viewer spends studying it. So in this case, notice the geomap is very large. So the viewer will spend more time focusing on the geomap than the other objects on the page. The placement of the objects are also important. So in this case, notice the geomap is in the right side or the left side, and then the details are on the right. Once you have your page set up the way you like, you can use page templates to speed up your development time. So I can create a page template of this and then use it in different reports as well. The placement of objects, like I said, is also important. You want to make sure that important objects appear in the upper left corner or at the top of the screen. That will change depending on which locality you're presenting the report in. In places that read from left to right, the upper left corner is the most important. That's what they'll focus on first. In localities where they read from right to left, you might want to put important objects in the upper right corner. So you want to create a focal point for your report. It's also important to group related objects together. Oftentimes people will compare these values without even having to be told to do so. So in this case, notice we have a column for South America that has 2 key values in a bar chart, and then a column for Europe that has 2 key values in a bar chart as well. Because they're related and they're close together, it's easier for the viewer to compare those values. You want to arrange objects with actions in a logical order. In places that read from left to right, typically the first object is displayed in the upper left corner, and then they are presented from left to right, top to bottom. In places that read differently or other localities, this order might change. So you need to, again, know your audience to determine how you're going to present those actions. But we can see in this particular page, the list control is in the upper left corner. This filters the geomap, which is in the upper right corner, which filters both of the objects at the bottom. So they are arranged logically. We'd also want to provide details to our report viewer about which actions are established. So this could be a video showing the actions. It could be text that describes them, something like that. Use negative space wisely. This helps present your report more cleanly. It makes a bigger statement than trying to fill all of the negative space with information. I know it's very tempting to use all of the white space to show something, but your report's going to have a bigger impact if you have more negative space so that the viewers can focus on the details. Notice both of these pages are showing the same exact information, but the page on the right is a little bit too cluttered. It's hard to read the information. It's hard to focus on what's important. It can be probably for some people a little stressful. So we want to use white space and padding to ensure that our objects kind of are not too close to other objects. Now, the default padding works really well for this. You can always modify it, but be cautious when you're modifying the padding from the default, because if you make it too large, it can be hard for users who are using smaller screens to see the information, or if they increase the zoom level above 100%. So if you do modify the padding from the default, make sure you test it on various screen sizes to make sure everything looks okay. Now, by default, Visual Analytics uses a grid layout to lay out objects on a page. You can use that to create objects that are next to each other and have all of the negative space that's required, or you can use containers. Some of the containers are very useful for displaying lots of information in a small amount of space. So one example is the prompt container. If your report has a lot of prompts, like in the report or the page prompt area, instead of displaying them all side by side, you can use a prompt container to have all of that information in one spot. This is especially useful for viewers who use mobile devices, because then they can just click the prompt container, specify all the values, and then click apply, and then those values will be applied to the report. The other thing why this might be useful is because all of those changes to prompts are only applied at the end when you click close and not in between. So it could make your report more performant. Another container that could be useful is the scrolling container. I really like this one because it's like creating a report that looks like a website. So viewers can scroll, the objects can be larger, you can display additional information like text to describe it. Basically, you can build a report that looks like a website. So that one can be very useful as well. The stacking container is great for showing the same information in two different ways. So remember I said that if you're using a very complex chart, it might be useful to show that same information in an easier to understand chart, like a list table or a bar chart. So you can use a stacking container to do that. In this case, I have a bar chart, and then I'm showing the same information in a list table. So if people want to see those additional details, they can. Now, one of the containers that most people want to use, and I try to avoid, is a precision container. Precision containers are very cool because you can overlap objects and put things on top of each other, but they can be very hard from a report design perspective because they might look different on different screen sizes. So if I create this really beautiful report using precision containers on my screen, and then someone with a different screen size looks at that report, it's not so beautiful anymore. So if you do use precision containers, which I recommend you try to avoid, you want to test a lot on various screen sizes, and you might want to consider using the fixed report size option. So what that does is it fixes the report size at a specific size, and then any screen that you view that report on, it's going to use that size. Be careful of that though, because if I'm viewing it on a large screen, the report will look quite small. If I'm viewing it on a small screen, users might have to scroll a lot to see it. So consider the layout. That's step 4. The final step is testing, testing, and testing again. And there are many different ways that we can test our report. The first is using the report review pane. This is in the right pane or the left pane of Visual Analytics. And what it does is it looks at your report and evaluates it for both performance and accessibility. Then it classifies each of your issues as low, medium, or high priority. So you can see the severity and then create a better report based on their recommendations. Notice there's an option to evaluate the performance of the report as well. So in this case, this report has a number of performance issues. I can see there's too many data sources, too many pages, there are data sources that are unused, too many objects for a specific page, calculations that aren't used, and then sometimes user-defined formats can affect the performance of the report as well. So it lists all of the issues of the reports and gives you the opportunity to fix them. We also see some accessibility issues. Color-dependent display rules is one, especially if those colors aren't different enough for people with color-deficient vision to see them. Lattices we talked about, and then always providing really descriptive object names. So the report review pane is a great first step for making sure your report is very performant and accessible. As you can see, for each of these items, it provides a description issue, and then it might even provide details or actions for you to fix it right from the review pane. So again, it's always best to provide meaningful titles for all of your objects for accessibility. And that is one of the things that will be pointed out on the report review pane. Next, after you've done that, it's time for a peer review. So give it to your colleagues and then make sure that they understand the report and they can answer these questions. What is the story? Is the report easy to navigate? Did you get lost? Did all the actions work? Were all the features apparent? And then use their feedback to make your report better than it was before. In addition, you might want to test your report on multiple devices and multiple screen sizes, especially if you have viewers that will be viewing the report on different devices. One way you can do this is from your browser window specifically. If you go to the settings for the browser, there's often an option, typically under More Tools, called Developer Tools that you can view the report from. And then there's a toggle device report toolbar that you can use to view the report on different screens. This is extremely useful. For example, if I know that a lot of my viewers are going to be viewing the report from iPads, I can look at the report in my browser window as an iPad user would see it, navigate it as an iPad user would navigate it, and make sure that it works and looks how I expect it to. If you use the precision container, it is extremely important that you test on multiple devices. Some other tests that you might want to perform are you might want to create a PDF of the report, which is something that happens when the report is distributed. This will ensure that the PDF looks okay, all of the objects come out okay, and that the report distribution will work correctly. You can also do a test print, like actually print it in a hard copy to make sure it looks good. This might also be useful if you print it in black and white. You can see if there's a sufficient difference in the luminosity between colors for people with color deficient vision to be able to distinguish between the different values. If you're going to project the report, you might want to actually project it before that day to make sure the colors look okay and everything's readable. If you're going to use the SAS Viya SDK for JavaScript to embed your report in a custom web page or application, go ahead and test it out and make sure everything looks good there as well. If you're going to use SAS for Microsoft 365, like to access the report from Excel or PowerPoint, test it out, make sure everything looks good. You might want to play the report if it's going to be played on a kiosk or for slideshows. And then if you're going to have viewers who view the report using different locales, different languages, you might want to test and make sure everything looks good. Another thing you could do for these users is to localize the report. So typically the only things that will change when you use a different locale are like the normal values for visual analytics. So like the data pane would be called whatever it's called in that particular language. Visual analytics would have a name for whatever that particular language. It doesn't localize data item values or data item names. So there is a way that you can localize the report for those languages so they appear. Okay, so that's the end. That's when you would test the report and make sure it's refined and make any finishing touches on the report. If you're interested in any of the resources that I used to build this presentation, SAS has a great website called the Beautiful Reports website that gives a whole bunch of tips for creating beautiful reports. A lot of them I showed in this presentation. There is also some documentation for visual analytics about creating accessible reports, which I recommend that you take a look at. They're always updating this, so they always have new information. I also use a lot of stories and books and publications by different visualization authors. All of these will be provided for you. So if you want to take a look at any of those, feel free to do so to get more information. And I think we're good for Q&A. So Tiago, if you have any questions that have come in, I'm ready for them.
All right, Nicole, now on to our first question here. We had someone ask, and you went over this, I believe, if you have a lot of information, is it better to have a longer page so a user would have to scroll down to see the whole report, or have multiple tabs so the user doesn't scroll but clicks across the tabs instead? And then I believe you touched on that, and they followed up. I'm thinking of website reports / dashboards rather than something that is more of a presentation. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, so it depends again on your audience. And remember, whenever we think about adding things to different pages, we want each page to stand on their own. So if there's information that you need them to know to understand other parts of the page, I would recommend maybe using a scrolling container and making a longer page that has those details rather than them having to remember it and jumping to a different page. Now, you can always provide additional details with links as well. So for example, let's say that I'm showing a geomap that has all of our customers, and I want to focus on a specific subset of customers and see details about them. I can link to another page that has details about that set of customers that I've selected instead of displaying it all on a single page. So both of those are valid. It just depends on what exactly you're trying to convey. So you'll want to think about, do they have to remember things to understand what's presented in a different page? And then you also want to think about, is there any way that I can limit the information they're showing by providing links? That's a good question. So there's no real answer. Sorry, it just depends.
Gotcha, thank you. We have someone else here asking, on the consider the layout page, referring to the table of contents, can you show where you get the text box designs for the layout of the table of contents? For example, you have circles with expanded borders for the text. Is that in SAS Viya?
Circles with expanded borders for the text.
Maybe it's those circles there.
These things, I'm guessing. These are from PowerPoint. They're not from Viya. So these examples on the right are the table of contents pages that we've created. And basically, I can describe how these were created. These are images. Both of these are image objects. And then we've added text objects. And in this case, at the bottom, we've used a background color to distinguish between the text objects. So this one has a gray background color with just text in it. This one has a gray background color with text and then links to additional information. Now, if you want to do something like this, you can always create it in PowerPoint and then make it an image and then add it to Visual Analytics. So that's totally possible as well. One of the things that I've been doing a lot for my table of contents pages is I've been adding a stacking container that has tabs where they can look at additional information. So one tab would be an overview, one tab would be about the data, one tab would be like an FAQ and things like that. I think that's very helpful as well. So everything you can use in the report, you can use on the table of contents page too. So I hope that answers the question. If not, let me know.
Thank you. Another question here. As a SAS 9.4 user, do I have access to SAS Visual Analytics? And if not, what is the report generator for 9.4?
Yep, in SAS 9.4, Visual Analytics is available there as well. And most of the things that I've talked about are available to you. There's some new features that came out with VIA, but I don't think we covered any of those in this presentation. So you should be able to use visual analytics and apply all of these things that I've talked about.
Thank you. Someone's asking, how would I make templates without SAS Visual Analytics?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that question, but I do know in Visual Analytics, you can make templates of pages and objects, and I kind of talked about those briefly. But for instance, once I have a page that has the layout that I like, that I might use a lot, I can create a page template from that and use it in different reports. And that can include just the objects and the options that are modified, or it can even include the data. So there are a couple of easy ways to do that in Visual Analytics. I think I have some blogs out about that, and I'll link to those in the Q&A so you can have access to those. But I'm not really sure about anything outside of Visual Analytics. This is really my specialty.
Gotcha. This question's kind of similar. You may not have an answer for it, but someone's saying, I'm a user of SAS Enterprise Guide. What tools would you recommend for building a report in EG?
Yeah, so I would not, because I use Visual Analytics. I know that there are ways that you can take the data from EG and populate it in VA and then display the report there, but I'm not an expert on Enterprise Guide.
Okay.
Sorry.
You have someone asking a question to follow up a previous one. How do I access Visual Analytics with SAS 9.4? Where do I go to begin?
Well, so you'll have to check with your SAS admin at your site to make sure that you have it licensed, but it's typically a browser window. So every time you access Visual Analytics, it's from a browser. You would get a specific website that's specific to your organization, and then you'd go there and sign in. So your SAS administrator at your organization would know if you have access to it, would know the site information, and then your login credentials. So you'll have to speak with them.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions today. On behalf of myself, Nicole, and all of SAS, we really hope that you enjoyed today's webinar. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.